Okaidi, welcome back to my channel, Made Between the Pages. My name is Taylor, and today we have another extremely exciting, I always say that, but it's true, episode of Page Chewing. Today we have one of my favorite authors, and she wrote one of my favorite series, the Memoirs of Lady Trent series, Maire Brennan. You might also know her under her pen name, where she co-writes, which is M.A Carrick. But either way, under whichever name, we are delighted to have you on the Page Chewing stage. If you wouldn't mind giving us just a little bit of a self-introduction, what you do, and what's your catalog like?
Yeah. Well, you've hit the highlights that I usually do for my little self intro. I write fantasy. I'm a full time writer and have been since 2008, I guess. So I've been doing this for a little while, full time. And yeah, I write novels, short stories, novelettes, novellas. I started writing poetry a couple of years ago. It is weird. It feels like my brain has begun speaking in tongues. I'm not sure what's going on there. I've written some stuff for games. Yeah, basically, I really like ranging through different forms, mostly in fantasy. Some of it has diverged over in kind of a dark fantasy to horror-ish direction. A few little excursions, sort of in the direction of science fiction, but mostly fantasy is the core of it, because that's just always what I've been interested in.
Yeah, and looking at the breadth of your work, you said that you wrote for games. I believe what is Legend of the Five Rings, the one that you write for. I'm not
One
a,
of the
a
ones,
gamer
yeah.
girly. I'm not a gamer girly, but I
Yeah,
do know that.
yeah.
But something that seems to be really consistent throughout all of your work, whether it's a gigantic, sprawling fantasy series, if you're writing for a game, all of those seem to have a core of world building
Yeah.
and intricate world building at that. Everything is connected. All of the details are taken care of about the Memoirs of Lady Trent series. And I want to start by asking you how your academic background has affected that, because I do know that you have a background of being an anthropologist and a folklorist, two things very close to my heart. I also majored in anthropology and linguistics. So I'm so excited because I
Yeah.
haven't talked about anthropology in so long. But I'm curious how that background affects the way that you wrote.
Yeah, it's well, yeah, the way that it affects my world building is a question I've been working on answering for years. I actually have a Patreon called New Worlds that is entirely about world building. And the reason I started up the Patreon is I have taught writing a number of times. I like thinking about the craft and so on. And I kept thinking that I would like to write a book about world building, but I could never figure out how to approach it, how to organize it. Like, it is a very large and sprawling topic, and it felt like every way I was thinking of felt very shallow, right? That it was only going to kind of like skip off the surface. And then it occurred to me that if I approached it via like a Patreon model, that what I could do is just write like one essay per week. And then when I had written the essays, then I could look at what I had and say, how do I organize this? I'm about to start year 8 of that Patreon. I'm not done yet. And now I go, oh, well, I can see why I couldn't figure out how to write a book about this, because I have a lot to say, it turns out. Uh, yeah, I did not go into college and graduate school saying, "What could I major in that would be useful to me as a fantasy writer?" But I did go in kind of going, "Well, what am I interested in?" Because advice to anybody who might be watching this who is, headed into college, my recommendation to people is choose your major by flipping through the course catalog and marking courses that look interesting to you. Then, whatever you have marked the most courses for, go ahead and major in that. Because mostly, unless you're doing something like pre med, what matters is, are you actually going to go to class and like do the reading and do the work? And so I took the approach of, let's major in things where I'll want to actually do my homework. And it worked out very well for me. But yeah, the M.A Carrick stuff in particular, my co-writer Alyssa Helms is also an anthropologist, and so I probably shouldn't pitch that series as when anthropologists attack, but it kind of is. It is us just really reveling in world building in that, like, all the textured detail, like, not just putting in the stuff that is required to make the plot go, but the stuff that is going to make the world feel like it is three-dimensional and lived in. I, writers will sometimes get asked, do you start with a character or a plot? And my two stock answers to that are, number one, I reject your false dichotomy, and number two, I start with a world. which isn't exactly true. Like, that's not always where I began, but I will usually have either a character in a world or a plot that is part of the world, that it's based in something about the setting. You couldn't just like pull that character or that conflict out and put it in a different setting and have it make any sense at all. It's got to be embedded in the world it takes place in. So yeah, that's just always been how my brain works. Yeah, that's how I'm wired, I guess.
I saw PL rubbing his hands together over there. Yeah, we're both world building fans. As an author himself, I'm sure he knows what goes into building a believable world, right?
I have to say, read your the Rook and I apologize. I think it's Rook and Rose, the
Yeah,
Master Mirrors series.
yeah.
That's been on my TBR for so long, and I haven't gotten to it yet, which I plan to rectify.
We
However,
all have a TBR up there somewhere, so yeah, I understand.
Until the day
but
I die, it's going to be there.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, that you're speaking to converted here, and it's curious that and I'm not sure if you read it. So Malazan, however
Mm.
you like to pronounce it, Stephen Erickson, another very such as yourself, another very popular author. His background is anthropology. So, what do you believe it is? I mean, obviously, an anthropological background. You're studying, origins, development of human societies, cultures, and languages, belief systems, uh, everything from institutions to social structures. Like, what is it about having that background? And it would seem more obvious, but what is it about having that background that makes you able to craft your world so realistically?
I mean, I think a chunk of it is just that if you major in anthropology, you probably get exposed to a really broad range of different cultures, different life ways, and it's very good at kind of um, estranging you in a positive sense from your own culture. That you get that distance where you kind of look at the way you live your life, that you've just been marinated in it the whole time you're growing up, unless you're somebody who, like, if you come from, say, a biracial background or you're an immigrant or something where you get that estrangement through your daily life. But if you grew up very much embedded in a culture and your parents are of the same culture, it just feels to you like that's natural. That's, of course, the way people do things. And it's only when you travel or like read about other things, which anthropology gets you to do, that you go, oh, wait, like, there's other ways of doing this. And in fact, often our ways of doing something are extremely arbitrary. And so it gives you that distance and that perspective. And like, I have actually made a point in more recent years because I realized I'd been writing the Onyx Court series, which are all historical fantasies set in English history. And I kind of only semi jokingly referred to that as my home PhD in English history. There was a stretch of time there where I was reading so much about England and about specific time periods and about related topics. And then when I came out the far side of that, I was doing the Memoirs of Lady Trent. And with that, at least, it would be things like, okay, I'm sending her to kind of a like Polynesian island sort of setting. So I'm going to go read about Polynesia. But I realized I'd fallen into this pattern where the only reading I was doing of that sort was very directed. It was, I know I want to write about this, therefore I'm going to go read about this. And what I had lost that I had while I was in college and in graduate school and wanted to get back was just feeding random stuff into the hopper. Like, I'm going to go read about the Mongols, not because I have a Mongol related thing I want to write, but just because I know very little about the Mongols. Let's go read about them. And so I started very deliberately trying to build that habit back up again and just read about all kinds of different stuff, because it keeps my brain flexible in ways that I think are very, very good for my writing, especially with the kind of writing that I do.
you actually touched on a point there that was a question that I had. In the Lady Trent series, you specifically have your character go to a very different setting each book.
Mhm.
So it is a Victorian setting. And I would argue the first book, kind of the way I pitch it is if, Pride and Prejudice or something met dragons, just
Mhm.
that kind of vibe. But
Yeah.
in every book, you specifically pull your main characters out of their comfort zone and put them in a new place. And I was wondering how you chose those different settings.
So for that series, because she is studying dragons in their natural environment, and the dragons are basically really interesting animals rather than being like magical creatures with human intelligence who speak and so forth. I actually drove it initially very much by environment, which is unusual for me. It's like, okay, so first book she's up in like a mountainous area. Next book, let's go to tropical swamp, okay, and then third book, how about islands? And it was that kind of approach. And because for that setting, I chose to do it as I sometimes will call it like world and a half because it's a secondary world. It's not our world, but everything is very clearly analogous to some place in our real world rather than being completely invented. Uh, so by choosing those environments, I was suggesting a set of possibilities for what the cultures in those areas might be. Uh, and as part of that, I kind of wanted the series to be a bit of an exploration of some of those different life ways. Like I actually did have a sort of mental list of like what are cultural things that I never see showing up in fantasy that I could just like toss into my world building, because I unlike with the Onyx Court books where it was real English history and I was very strictly sticking with what was happening in that year in that place. With these I had a little more flexibility. uh and so I was looking at things like matrilineal descent, or like polygyny, meaning multiple wives, and polyandry, meaning multiple husbands, and so on. Various things like that, and just going, where can I put this in here somewhere? Because I don't see this very often, and why not? Uh, so yes, it started with the environment, but then also became a little bit of let's break out of just the standard assumptions that I think a lot of especially English speakers tend to have, and show some of the other possibilities.
That was an extremely pleasant surprise for me when I was reading. I was like, "Oh, I haven't seen this before. I'm digging this. I'm into it."
So
And then I
I
go
do have
ahead.
to say, because you were commenting before about things fitting together well, you just
Yeah.
reminded me that Tropic of Serpents, the second book of that series, I put together polygyny, the one guy with multiple wives, and matrilineal descent. Those don't play together well. I should not have done that in hindsight. Like, those did not belong in the same society. But, it was an interesting
Yeah.
adventure trying to figure out how that would work.
It's a thought experiment, right?
Yeah.
Basically. Actually, that's a perfect segue into the next question that I had, which is we've talked to Fonda Leon here before, and
Mhm.
I don't want to misquote her, so I'm going to look down to read what she said. In our conversation, she said, I like going down that speculative rabbit hole and saying, okay, this is now a speculative conceit, and how will that affect everything else
Mhm.
in the world, the economy, and all of that?
Yeah.
And she mentioned it as a rabbit hole. So you can kind of go forever doing these types
Oh,
of
yeah.
things. So what you mentioned before about, having a matrilineal based society and then having, a another part of that culture that contradicts that.
Mhm.
Have you ever kind of met your match in the world building space where there was a problem that you just couldn't quite figure out?
I don't feel like I've ever gotten trapped in that way because I think in part, like, I don't tend to outline rigorously, like, I'll have a vague sense of certain beats I wanna hit and such, but it means that if I run into something where I go, "Well, if this is true and also this is true, then, how does that work?" I'm kind of willing to just roll with, like, "Okay, well, that's an interesting problem," rather than feeling like, "Oh, crap, that's getting in the way of my plot," because I have much less of a predetermined idea of the plot. There have been moments where I have gotten tripped up on something of just going, "Oh, wait, I need to kind of massage how I present this to make sure that I haven't screwed myself up here." I think Tropic of Serpents was apparently where I did this a lot because you get the group of people. But I'm going to kind of avoid spoilers here, but the important thing with them is that they haven't killed. And I was like, wait, so here's the things that Isabella has done. Let me think about how they define what counts as killing for the purposes of being, part of this group, because that was something that could have gotten in the way. But I'm working in, my own invented world, and it's an anthropologically realistic thing that people would say, like, oh, you cannot have killed, but if you've like swatted bugs or whatever, that doesn't count. Because, you know, it's things like uh oh god, I'm trying to remember in in Japan, isn't there something of like the counter that you use for rabbits in the Japanese language is the same one that you use for birds? And there's like the weird conceptual things around what things count as like meat and don't. And yeah.
Listen, don't get me started on Japanese counter system. It makes zero sense. And to this day, I still get things wrong. I've been living here for
Yeah,
quite a
when in
while.
doubt, sue. When in doubt, sue is just a nice, safe one to go with. Yeah.
Exactly. But yes, there is a difference between those two categories,
Yeah.
how you would count things.
And things of like,
And
I think it was venison got sold under the name of autumn leaves in a like, we're gonna kind of euphemistically pass this off as it's totally fine, like and it got sold
yeah.
as like medicine, so then it's not meat. This is like back in the Edo period and such. So those kinds of society will then have all the weird like bends and loopholes and ways that things get massaged. I love putting that into stories because I feel like a lot of fiction presents, here's how the world works, and that is how it works. And everybody understands and everybody follows it the same way. And I'm like, have you met human beings? We are so much less consistent than that, and that is fun to play with.
Oh, for sure. Even the way that we conceptualize language, like what is killing, what is, taboo, what is even time. You get some cultures that time is not a linear thing. So I love how you played with those things in your story. It really comes through that's a passion of yours.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I feel too like, and I want to pose this question to you, Maria. I know for myself as an author and world building something near and dear to my heart as well. With your anthropological background, obviously, I'm sure your world is extremely deep, extremely nuanced. Do you find that, because we writers, we have our strengths and we have our things that we need to work on. Do you ever find that one of the things as lush and amazing and everything that it adds to your writing with your world building, do you ever find that you have to rein yourself in and focus more on characters or plot or action, or is there sometimes a struggle there, or maybe perhaps there isn't? Right?
So this is actually something that Alyssa and I have discussed in doing the M.A Carrick stuff, because we both very much delight in coming up with the details of the world. And not everything that we come up with makes it into the books. Like that's the first thing. And this is also true. I thought about this a lot with the Onyx Court books when I was doing my research. It's kind of, people will use the iceberg metaphor of, only 10% of it, maybe more than 10%. But the point is, there's going to be stuff below the surface that you maybe never actually put into the story, but like that is how it works. Like one of the random things we know that never made it into the books is, what does Versenian culture do when like one of the people in a marriage is sterile or trans, and therefore like biological reproduction between these married people can't work? Like, what do they do about that? And we know the answer to that. That's not in the story because it's not relevant to the story. So part of it is, that you just have to like show a little bit of restraint and don't show all of your homework on the page. But the other thing that we've talked about a lot is that we are a little bit less kill your darlings and a little bit more put your darlings to work. If there's something that we want to have, we actually talked about this with our editor when we were working on The Mask of Mirrors. There was precisely one scene that we ended up cutting from the book, because our editor said the thing is, this is not a book where like an entire scene could just be removed and you'd be fine, because that scene is tied in with 8 other things, and if you take that out, you got to find ways to get all those threads to connect again, or the thing is going to start to fall apart. And so anytime we had something where we thought, this is really cool, we want to have it in the story, then the scene it is in had better justify its existence. So how can we make this develop and show the character? And how can we make this tie into, not just one plot, but if we do this and this, then it ties into 3 plots and our editor can't make us take it out. So we are of the put your darlings to work school of thought. Make them justify their existence and tie them in so tightly that they cannot easily be snipped out.
I love that phrase, put your darlings to work. I'll probably steal it at some point. I'll give you credit for it. I'll probably use it. I promise. I'll probably use it. I love that. And that's just such a fascinating way to think about characterization. And, and your characters, we always think, I think as writers that, our characters have agency. And sometimes they go in places we don't intend them to, and sometimes they even take over plot threads that we didn't originally plan for them to be part of. And but I love that putting your characters to work. I love that.
Well, and I think the kill your darlings advice is one that sometimes gets misunderstood, because really what it means is if there's something that is fundamentally like not helping or even damaging the story, like it is just kind of killing your pacing, or it's out of character for that character, even if you love it in its own right, if it's not helping the story, then it needs to go. That's what I think kill your darlings is actually meant to mean. Don't let your love for that thing blind you to the ways that it's not working. And so that is why I think put it to work is a perfectly viable alternative, because if you can find a way to keep that and still make it like that it stops being a detriment to the story and starts contributing, then hey, cool, you've solved your problem.
100%. 100%. I love that too. And something that's striking me about this conversation is you talked before about building a backstory that isn't necessarily on the page.
Mhm.
And I would argue that a lot of that, well, let me not speak for you, but I would think that some of that might come from the folklore background that you have as
Mhm.
well. Because
Yeah.
I also, Pianosis, I ask every guest about their origin story. I love folklore. I actually have a series on my channel where I do like introductions to Japanese yokai and folklore
Mm.
because I'm obsessed with it. I just think it's so fun. Fun is one, well, interesting. Let's say that. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes not. But having that background, that lore that you know in the back of your mind can help you characterize things in the world to match that
Mhm.
that better, because you have that awareness even if the reader doesn't know it. So it adds to this cohesive structure in the way that folklore and mythology adds to a cohesive structure of a culture, right? It's a shared
Yeah.
history for those people. And so I kind of want to talk a little bit about folklore here, because I know that for Legend of the Five Rings, that is Japanese based, I believe.
Yeah.
And
Those books
I heard
of
you.
mine are actually wall-to-wall yokai, so you might enjoy them.
Okay. Yeah, because I did listen to a podcast you were on previously where you
Mhm.
talked about like more in depth about those books
Mhm.
that you wrote. And I just wanted to ask just a fun little question out there. Do you have a favorite yokai or mythological story from Japan? Because
I
for me, I'm obsessed with the kasaobake.
Okay.
It has nothing around it. It's just hanging out.
Yeah. Mine is similar. It's the Mokomokoren, which is basically if you have a paper screen that gets holes torn in it, like it's getting, kind of beaten up and old. The Mokomokoren is just these eyes that will like blink at you from inside the tears of the screen. And that's all it does. Like, and this sticks with me because Legend of the Five Rings is a setting based on Japanese history, actually several periods of Japanese history kind of mushed together for more narrative opportunities. And earlier editions of the game had a bit of a problem where they tried to tie practically everything supernatural in with this kind of like spiritual taint that tried to like take people over. And also just because it's a game, everything had to be dangerous. So the game tried so hard to make the Mokomokoren into some kind of dangerous monster that you had to fight. And I'm like, no, it is just eyeballs that blink at you from a torn screen. That's it, Ijo. Like, you don't need to do more. It's adorable that it's just this little, take care of your screens or there might be something looking at you through them.
I don't want to interrupt, but it sounds great, and I know it's going to be cute, but that sounds creepy as hell.
Well, yeah, I mean, it can be creepy. Like,
That sounds
it's the
creepy
sort
as
of thing
hell.
when you imagine being, especially somebody in like pre-modern times where this is going to be ubiquitous in your surroundings and you don't have great lighting in your houses and everything, yeah, the thought of something watching you is just a little bit spine tingling, but it's not like it's going to kill you, right? It's just creepy. That's it. You're done. And so yes, I love the Mokomokoren.
Yeah, I just love that stories like that don't necessarily have to have a morality assigned to them. And I think that's
Yeah,
something in the West that we really struggle with. Like we
yeah,
attach a morality to a story. If it's good, it's bad, or it has to be labeled as morally gray. Sometimes it just isn't any of that. It just
yeah,
is eyes looking at you from a screen.
yeah.
Or
It
like
just
the
exists.
kappa, right?
Yeah.
So I did a whole episode on the kappa, and that ranges from cute little chibi little characters to will rip your liver out of your asshole, like those. It's like both of those exist.
Yep.
So it's like you can't categorize
Yeah.
these stories because they change and fit different situations,
Yeah.
and it can be used as a cautionary tale as well to keep children away from rivers.
Mhm.
They're just so flexible. So I think that I can also see a lot of that folklore background in your stories as well, because there's this cohesive feel to what you create in your stories. Would you argue that folklore, that part of your background helps as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would do it a little bit more broadly because the official name of my department was folklore and mythology. And so I've come to realize that, like, especially on a world building front, if it's like, how do you know you're reading a Maire Brennan novel? Religion will come into it somewhere, probably. Uh, because, if you read history, religion has been so freaking important and pervasive in ways that I think a lot of modern people, especially in the West, can really underestimate how much religion was a part of society and a part of people's daily lives. Because I read a lot of fantasy novels where, there's many things I enjoy about them, but the religion feels kind of like it's just, pasted on and we're done. That it's like a couple of colorful god names and that's it. And it doesn't feel like a thing that matters to the characters in their lives. So yeah, for me, the layer, especially because fantasy is, very often about magical things in some fashion. And I don't see magic and religion as being separate categories because they usually haven't been seen as separate categories. So, yeah, that underlying what's the cosmology? What do people believe about it? How do they interact with it on a spiritual level, as well as I have these magical abilities that can make the plot go? Like, that's hugely interesting to me. It comes up over and over again in my books. The memoirs are actually unusual in that religion is relatively unimportant in those, other than like, hey, everybody in Europe basically is Jewish. But Isabella herself is like, I don't care that much about religion. I just want to study dragons.
A worthy pursuit. I saw PL getting excited over there because I know religion is a huge theme. Magic and religion are huge themes in your books as well, right?
And it's what I love to read about. And I love when there is a connection, and when magic and religion essentially they complement. I love to see them complement each other. I love to see them clash. And I love the concept of one culture believing that their religion is the preeminent one, and that everything other than that is heresy, and that or paganism, and that clash, that is something that really, so I can't wait to read your book. So I'm just salivating here about getting to read your book. So
Yes.
sounds right up my alley.
Yes, we got another one. I also did want to put this up here. Margaret's here, and she says I need to read both of these folk series. And thank you for joining us. But yes,
I'm honored. We're honored. Thank you, Margaret.
Definitely. Now, oh, I'm sorry, Marie. Did you want to?
No, I was coughing. I had muted myself briefly so that I wouldn't cough into the microphone.
Gotcha. Okay. So we could talk about world building all day, and it's clearly something that you excel at. But I don't want to be remiss and not talk about your characters, because Lady Trent, the Memoirs of Lady Trent, you're from her perspective and her narrative voice the whole time. And it is such a strong narrative voice. And you know that you're reading from Lady Trent's perspective, right? And that takes a lot of work to build a narrative voice that strong, that has that much of a sense of self. And just to give people a little bit of an idea, I just want to put a small quote from Lady Trent to show her kind of quippy, dry humor. So there's a small quote here from the editorial page of the Falchester Weekly Review, which is like a little mini thing that Miss Brennan wrote between two books. But she is, in this moment, Lady Trent is writing a response to another academic paper. And she doesn't quite believe that this person actually found what they found. And so there's just this one quip at the very end where she says, I may dare hope that Mr. Talbot is even now preparing such an article for publication, whether in your magazine or elsewhere, for I have awaited further information with bated breath, and I fear I will soon turn blue for lack of oxygen. So that's just a small snippet of the amount of sass and wit Lady Trent has. So how did you develop this strong of a character?
So Partly it was because I had done the Onyx Court books right before that. Each one of those takes place in a different century of English history, and the last one is Victorian. So I had spent the better part of a year marinating myself in Victorian stuff for that book. I was able to segue very easily into a, Victorian period, but not sort of setting for the memoirs. So part of it was just that research and, prior exposure to Victorian literature and such. When it came to the voice itself, this was a place where I just lucked into it. Like, I know authors who will go through all kinds of exercises to develop a voice for a character. Those exercises don't work for me. I'm really bad at that approach. There's either a strong voice or it kind of defaults to like my usual like especially in third person narration. Like there's a certain style that I think I will go with when nothing else presents itself. But this one, I was like one paragraph into writing A Natural History of Dragons when the voice was boom right there. Like, okay, she's talking to me. And PL, you mentioned before, if people will speak as if their characters will like take over the narrative, go in unexpected directions. And it's not that like I actively believe my characters have some existence apart from me, but I've had those moments where it feels like something else has taken control. And when that happens, it means my subconscious has figured something out. And I have learned that always trust the subconscious. When things go veering off the rails, it's because I have had a better idea without necessarily realizing it. And I need to follow that. That actually happened with my first published book. There was one moment where I knew exactly how this particular scene was going to go, and I was writing it. And this is the book that is now published as Warrior. It was originally Doppelganger. Uh, Character delivers an impassioned speech of like, yes, I didn't do this particular thing, but you don't understand. You've never been in that position. You've never had to make the choice that I made. And it was like this character just looked up off the page at me and said, "Wrong." And I'm like, "Oh my god, you went through that. That means this." And oh my god. And like I literally don't know how that book would have ended if that moment hadn't happened, because it ended up being key to the entire thing. So yeah, the subconscious is smarter than me. When the narrative voice shows up, we go with the narrative voice, even if it's not the one I intended. I've got a short story called The Wives of Paris, which it's an alternate thing, basically, of what if Paris had made a different judgment with the golden apple in Greek mythology? Like, what if he'd given it to Hera? What if he'd given it to Athena? And when I came up with the idea, I was like, and yes, I will push myself for a lyrical, mythic. Why is this turning snarky? It's snark. I guess we're going snarky. Okay, well, it means I can start referencing like Snow White and Norse sagas in the middle of this story. Like, sure, this is what we're doing now. And it remains one of my favorite short stories, actually. So yeah, the voice was there. It was there because I'd done that preparatory work of knowing a lot about the period, but also just it showed up and it was one of the best things the series had going for it.
I can say, and I did the audiobooks first time through. So
Kate Redding did an amazing job with them.
they match so well. The voice and always opt for snark. I'm sorry, I had to pull this up. Yes, Margaret, yes.
Yeah.
It gives you a bit more breadth in your story, right? You can have some more wiggle room when you have that kind of lighter touch. So
And what I love, I guess I feel what I love about Starkey characters is I connect humor, i.e., with wit, i.e., with intelligence, right? So smart people, to be really, really funny, I find those people really brilliant. Those characters are really brilliant, and they have this intellect that it's really sharp. And that's why I think I love, for example, Joe Abercrombie. He's the master of writing the snarky, sarcastic. Those characters just leap off the page, right? And so I think humor. When I think about anthropology and I think about the world building and the nuances, a lot of it for me is about all the aspects of a lived human experience. For example, a lot of fantasy readers, everybody's entitled to their taste. They say, "Oh, I don't want to read romance in my fantasy," and I respect that. I understand why romance may not be a particular genre that you enjoy, and you don't want to see that sprinkled into your fantasy. However, for me, romance, sex, that's part of the lived experience, and that's part of the realism books, just like battle scenes, etc. Right? Whatever you like, and world building, whatever you like in your fantasy. So what I love about what I'm hearing about your writing, Marie, is that it incorporates all the aspects of the lived experience, which only accentuates the realism.
I have to say, when it comes to humor and stuff, I'm not going to like name names because I try not to like go bagging on other authors, but there was a series that I quit reading partway through because there was actually a moment where the character said something that made me laugh. And then I realized that felt like the only point in like all the books I had read thus far where somebody said something funny. And like everything else was just like so unrelentingly dark. And it's not that like dark doesn't have a place, but also humor is part of how human beings cope with bad shit. And so when nobody ever seems to crack wise, a part of me starts to just go numb and think like I don't feel like there's the same like degree of dynamics going on here that I might be looking for. But also the flip side is true because like the Marvel Cinematic Universe has come under a fair bit of fire for the tendency to always undermine the moment with some witty quip. And I'm like, yeah, and there's a point at which you're undercutting your own intensity by feeling like you've always got to back off to that ironic distance and make some little flippant line here, and you miss the chance to really hit people in the feels. And so it's a balancing act, right? And I also think there's different ways of approaching the humor. I like putting in those moments that are funny, but they're not necessarily like what I would necessarily label as snark. There are just, those little bits of commentary or something where the reader might be laughing even if the character isn't, basically. It's the reader can see what is funny there, even when it is being utterly serious for the character. I trying to find that sort of balance, I really enjoy doing. Um, so yeah, I don't want all of one or all of the other is really what it comes down to.
No, I agree, and I absolutely love when, as in real life, if someone is, hopefully, a well-rounded and emotionally secure and has a certain degree of emotional intelligence, that the characters laugh at themselves. So we see funny situations where a character laughs at themselves, b, maybe other characters haven't laughed at characters' expense, or c, as you indicated, maybe character not laughing, but we as a reader find it funny.
Yeah,
So
I'm actually in the middle of reading Martha Wells' Murderbot series right now, and that's a really good example of there will be lines in there that Murderbot's narration is not trying to be funny. I'm laughing my ass off, and like it's perfect because it's all the little things where Murderbot, for anybody who doesn't know, this is a kind of like cyborg machine intelligence that is having to cope with human beings and like all these emotions and things. And so there's repeated lines about, and I had to shut down for a few minutes because I was having an emotion. And I'm like, yes, Murderbot, you're having an emotion. Pat you on the head. Like, it's not funny to you. It's adorable to me. And that's the intended effect here. PL, what you said about, characters who are like emotionally stable. And I'm thinking, well, there's our problem. I mean, for starters, half of them are not. Like, that's what makes them interesting is they're not emotionally stable and mature.
oh, I hear you. That's what I love to write about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because with stories in general, we want. I actually wrote an article for the SIFWA blog about this. That there's been lots of discussions about conflict in fiction, and like, do you need a conflict? Is that a very Western centric view of fiction? And so the argument I presented was a kind of a definition of conflict that is basically, I think I phrased it as like the imbalance that puts the story in motion. There is something that causes it to be not static. It's not necessarily A versus B in some fashion, but there is something that can't stay status quo. Um, and so, yeah, having characters not be good at emotions is one of the ways to put things in motion because they're not coping right.
Yeah, or having characters that are, overreact to situations, or are, somewhat emotionally imbalanced, and their reactions are a source of conflict in themselves.
Yeah,
That like they love drama and they love to cause drama, and they're always at the center of it. So but yeah, I love reading those kind of.
I think I know who you're talking about, Bio. Like your favorite characters. But...
I'll admit though, I actually have trouble writing that sort of thing of the characters who like are just drama magnets and drama machines, because that is very fundamentally not me. And so that's an area where I know like I don't do that well in my writing because I don't think that way, and it's hard for me to write a character behaving that way and feel like I'm doing it in a way that I go, ah, yes, I totally see why they're behaving like this.
I think for me, it's so much about and in my mind, I'm saying I'm not one of those people, but that's how I see myself. Hopefully, other people don't see me that way. However, I think for me, it's so much about my life experience and
Yeah,
seeing so much of that and seeing so many people like that. And I think
right,
as authors, of course, the vast preponderance of what we draw on is our life experience. We
right.
bring what we know to what we write. So since I've had the pleasure of seeing a lot of human drama, I tend to bring that into life.
Yeah, whereas my husband has been known to refer to my family as abnormally normal. I I grew up in a very low drama family as well, so yeah, I don't have as much of that, like, marinated in the experience of people like that, even if I'm not one myself. But we all have the different things that we gravitate to. So
That is actually perfect for what I wanted to say next, which is that, we're talking about humor and personal taste. And so there's this concept in anthropology, okay, bear with me, it connects, which is the observer's paradox, right? So the act of observing a thing changes the thing. So can you really observe the thing? And this is really key to anthropology, when you're going to go to do like an ethnographic study or something like that, you need to know, or you need to take into account that aspect.
yeah.
But this is also true with stories because they change in the telling and in the hearing and in the
Mhm.
reading. And you really get to the heart of what a story is or what it was intended to be? I argue you can't, and that's kind of the beauty of it because each person changes it. And that's a big part of anthropology, mythology. We're coming full circle here, but but I do want to take that concept and kind of ground it a little bit and ask you, when you put your books out into the world,
Mhm.
PL and I have talked about this before, they're no longer yours, right? So they change in the telling, they change in the observation,
Mhm.
other people observing your work. And I'm wondering, as someone who writes so prolifically, even for a game, right? So people
Mhm.
take your setting and then do what they
Yeah.
want with your setting, right? So you're really gifting these words to someone else. So how do you kind of, as an author, deal with that? Maybe if you feel someone isn't not interpreting it wrong, those are the wrong
Mm.
words to use, but maybe is using it in a way that you didn't perceive when you created it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of ways that people cope with that. Like, I know a great many writers who will never read any reviews of their books because they know it's just going to mess with their head. I will sometimes read reviews. In particular, like early in my career, I think there were times where I got some very useful feedback out of that. Like I remember a review of Doppelganger that was generally a positive review, but it made a passing comment about me overusing italics, and they were right. Like I will totally grant that. I leaned much too hard on italics, trying to convey the way I heard the sentences being said in my head. Uh, so like that was an example of me trying to kind of um, mandate that the reader would hear it the way that I was hearing it in my head, which you're never going to achieve entirely. Like even with an audiobook, unless I'm the one reading the audio, I've done narration of my stories before, and so then I can be certain it will be delivered exactly the way I hear it in my head, but the rest of the time, no, and that's fine. Like with a good audiobook narrator, they are contributing their own interpretation, their own performance to it, and that's a cool thing. I think it helps a little bit for me that I do have the background in folklore because I'm like, yeah, stories are these very multifaceted, mutable, they exist in different versions kind of thing. Uh, I definitely have read things like reviews of my own work where I sort of have a reaction of, well, that's sure a take you got there. I don't agree with it. But it happens. I've also had the experience of reading reviews where um I actually wrote a review like this once that gave me the phrase I'm about to use. I wrote a review of Ellen Kushner and Delia Sherman's Fall of the Kings, which led to me then meeting Ellen and Delia because their reaction upon reading it was, somebody read the book we thought we wrote. That my review had just nailed what they were trying to do. And I've gotten a couple of reviews. I think there was one for A Natural History of Dragons and Strange Horizons that it had some criticisms. There were some things where it said, like, here's what I don't think it did so well. And I read that and I was like, that's entirely fair, but this review feels like you read the book I was trying to write. And there's There's a line I want to say in I've only seen the movie of History Boys, which is also a play, where it talks about that feeling of like, a hand has reached out and touched yours for just a moment. I forget how exactly it's phrased, but it's exactly that feeling of when you see that a reader, like you manage that moment of connection, that you telepathically beamed what was in your head into somebody else's head. It is magical. And it is also magical where somebody gets a reading out of it that you're like, that's not even necessarily like what I was focused on, but it meant so much to you. I get that with certain things in the Memoirs of Lady Trent. I don't want to give spoilers, but some things in Isabella's life that I've had readers contact me and say, this spoke to me so deeply because of my own life experience. And I'm sitting there going, holy shit, because that thing is not my life experience. This is not a thing I've ever been through, but I managed to still speak to that for you. That's amazing. That is what makes this job so cool. Like, I'm gonna be honored for the rest of my life that I managed to do that for another person. So, it goes all over the map, you know?
That's fantastic. And yes, it's immensely gratifying. But I do find, and I'm not sure how you feel, Maria, as an author. I do find, I mean, when we write books, we take accountability for what we write. As
Yep.
authors, I think that you'll find authors are frankly some of the most accountable people you're going to encounter. However, as Taylor aptly pointed out, and as Marie is alluding to, yeah, that someone's going to read your book and they might have a totally different interpretation of based versus how you intended it to come across, and you have to accept their obviously valid interpretation and feelings and thoughts and reaction to your book. And it's very much, for me, I describe it as very much like you letting your kids go to school. And you want everyone to love your kids. You want everyone to see what you love about your kids in your kids. You want them to be popular. You want them to be, respected. You want everyone to like them. You're seeking that validation of your kids. However, that's not realistic. That's not what's going to happen.
Sometimes your
And
kids are little shits when they're not around you, you know?
yeah, exactly. So, and that is probably been of all the things I'd say is, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, just a challenge per
Yeah.
se in being an author. That's probably one of the most challenging things I've ever encountered. I thought I would have other challenges and other things that would, I don't want to say irk me, but would definitely pose more issues for me. But that was the one that, of all the things that of being an author, I think that's the one that stands out the most as potentially challenging.
I will say the one thing that does rub me the wrong way when it happens is when I will read, and it's not just of my books. So, like when I read this in reviews of other things, I try to be careful of this when I'm posting on my own blog about what I read, not to like make assumptions about what the author was thinking or why they did a thing. Even when it's not my own work that's being spoken of that way, it gets up my nose because I'm like, you do not actually know. Well, unless they talked about it like in an interview, you do not know what the author was thinking. You don't know why they made that choice. So, anything where you're like, well, they obviously thought this. I'm like, no, they didn't. Like, it comes across as if they thought that. There are ways that you can soften the language on it. That's the one part that I will admit that I bridle at a little bit. That I'm like, you don't know what was going through that other person's head. So careful with
Yeah,
what assumptions you make.
I totally agree. We all have a trigger. I think that's one of my, but I think my top one is, I don't know why. It's fair when you do it, but when someone writes a review and says, if I was writing this book, I would have written it. I would have written this part this way. And you know what? That's fantastic. Would love to see you write your book.
Go write your own one.
Write it your way,
Yeah.
rather than, because I'm sorry, but I did write it this way.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things that we some people get lost in the fact that, okay, writing is art, and it's very subjective in terms of what people believe that art is. But remember, the writer is the artist, and you can appreciate all different kinds of art, and you might like one painting that's totally different from another. Same with books, but that's part of the uniqueness, that writer wrote that book that way with whatever intent she or he made, and they didn't write it the way perhaps you want to write it, but that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've definitely had reactions where I'm like, yeah, I really wish that this had been a bit more like this. But again, I try to be careful in how I phrase it, where it will be clear that I craved more of this, but that's not what the book was. And in particular, another reader might say, but the thing that it was sounds fantastic. I'm going to go buy it right now. And I'm like, cool, enjoy it.
We actually just had that discussion yesterday with the other guests that we had here about negative reviews, how well-written negative review sells books.
Yeah.
If you articulate what you wanted more of or whatever.
Or even just knowing the reviewers' tastes. When I was growing up, I lived in Dallas. The Dallas Morning News had this one film reviewer named Philip Wunsch. And with, the tastes that I had when I was in high school, pardon me. Basically, if Philip Wunsch hated a movie, I went and saw it. Because I knew that his taste, he was the kind of reviewer who would be saying, oh, and this movie does this thing that was done better in this 1963 French film. And I'm like, well, you know what? I've never seen that 1963 French film. And also, you hate action movies. I love action movies. So you hated this one. I'm going to go buy a ticket. But yeah, a lot of it is, I think it helps to, as a reader, like, find the right reviewers to know that their tastes align with yours or usefully don't align with yours, such that that you can use them kind of as a guideline for what are you going to enjoy.
Yes, and I think this is also really useful for recommendations. Like for Lady Trent as well, people see A Natural History of Dragons, and I can't tell you the number of people who are like, "Oh my god, dragons, I love them." I'm like, "What? Take a second. Okay, they're not going to be telepathically linked and like
this is not Pern or whatever.
In the sky. Like that's just Lady Trent is fantastic. It's one of my favorite books ever, but I know you, and I don't think the dragons are what you want, when you think of dragons. So,
well, and even like from an industry standpoint, I don't know if this is still true, but I suspect it probably is. Back when I first started publishing, I think it was Teresa Nielsen Hayden, who's an editor at Tor, quoted research that had been done on why do people buy books. The number one reason somebody buys a book is they have read something by that author before and enjoyed it. Okay. The number two reason they buy a book is a friend recommended it to them. And everything else, the cover art, the blurb, the advertising, all of the standard like marketing, is an incredibly distant third to those two factors. Those are the main things that move it. So, hey, everybody out there who has ever recommended a book to a friend, you are what makes this engine go. Like, seriously, that is because you get that relationship of, I know my friend, I know what they like. If I recommend a thing to them, they can trust that I'm probably on base about you will like this. Or, yeah, this is not going to be your thing. Go try something else instead.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's BookTube. It's got my heart. That's why we love what we do.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I did want to kind of go a little bit more towards writing craft, if you'll follow me here for a second.
Absolutely.
Where not only do you write big, sprawling, epic fantasies under M.A Carrick and Maire Brennan as well, but you also write tons of short stories. And like I've said a couple times here, you write for games. You just do a plethora of lengths and styles. So for you, is there a specific way you approach the different lengths of what you're going to write? So, okay, I'm going to write a short story. This is how I go about that. Or, okay, I'm going to write, my goal here is to write, a trilogy, a big epic trilogy. How do you approach those two different types of writing?
That's a good question. And I'm going to see if I can answer it anything like concisely. Because there's several different answers there. The thing I'll say at the outset is that I was a natural novelist. I wrote 2 perfectly competent novels, both of which are now published, before I wrote a single short story that did not abjectly suck. I was so bad at them. I did not get it. Everything I tried to write was either a plotless vignette or me trying to cram way too much story in way too small of a space. Until there came a day when I went, oh, that's what a short story-sized idea looks like. Now I know what to look for. And at that point, I began being able to write short stories. So it was kind of a switch flipping for me on that. And that's part of the answer is learning how to judge what size of an idea you have. And there's some amount of flexibility in it. And I think depending on your process, there might be more or less flexibility. But for me, when I get a concept, I usually have a sense of, yeah, that's that's basically something that I can do in a short story, or no, that's a novel, or that's actually a jumping off point for a series. Like I could do multiple novels that are built off of this. Cool, let's go. Uh, and that's a sense that I've just kind of developed over time. The writer Marissa Lingen at one point used the term proprioception for this, which I really like. Proprioception is your sense of your own body and like where it is in space. And, I know that something is within arm's reach because I know how long my arm is. So you kind of develop proprioception about the size of your story and how close are you to the end and so on. Short stories for me, most of the time, I mentioned that, like, with novels, I don't really tend to outline. I'll usually have a few points that I'm like, this is what's going to happen at the halfway point, and this will happen at the three-quarters point, and I'm just kind of slowly navigating my way toward that for whatever word count I'm aiming for. Um, Every so often, I'm wildly wrong about that. I was working on In Ashes Lie, which is the second Onyx Court novel, and a little way into it, I emailed my editor and basically said, "You can have a book that is the length of the previous one, or you can have a good book. Which one do you want?" And she told me as long as I didn't go above a certain line, I was fine. And that one ended up like 30,000 words longer than what I thought it was going to be, because it turned out I was just wrong in how large that book was. It happens occasionally. Short stories, on the other hand, will usually show up for me as kind of a whole concept. Or rather, like I've got one story that I really want to finish one of these days, just as soon as I figure out where in God's name I'm going with it. Because that's one of those, okay, well, so what if there was a world where this was true, and this happens to this particular character, and I don't know. I haven't figured out where that one's going yet. And when I do, boom, I'll have the rest of the story in probably a day, maybe two. Um, so I have little like openings to stories sitting on my hard drive waiting for that to happen. But those will usually show up more as either a premise, which eventually finishes itself, or just all as a unit all at once. Um, that's a very different beast from a novel, because novels are endurance sports, right? They are a marathon, not a sprint. I mean, there are people like Sean and McGuire in the world who can just like sneeze and a novel falls out, but most of us are not like that. Uh, so yeah, it for me was recognizing that there are different gears for different things. And that actually was the same thing with poetry. I mentioned I've started doing that. It's because I was looking at my list of possible story ideas at one point, and I looked at one item and thought, that's not really a story, right? Like I've got a concept, but there's no plot, there's no character. Like, where's the actual story here? And something in the back of my brain went, what if poem? I was like, what language are you speaking about this poetry thing? And I wrote a sonnet and I really like it. And so at that point, my brain started going, oh, okay, yeah, some of these ideas that have never gone anywhere because they're not really stories, they could be poems instead. Cool, let's do that. I don't know if that answers your
I
question at all.
Oh, perfectly. And I love how your brain was like, "What if all
Yeah,
vibes, no plot?" Like, what if that was the case, you
yeah,
know? We could
yeah.
we could do that.
Well, it feels a little bit
Yeah,
like waste not, want not, because I could have just said, well, that idea is never going to go anywhere. But I still got something out of it because I just turned it into a different thing.
for sure, for sure.
That is incredible. Marie, I just, and this is something that I I think about a lot, especially when we speak to authors like yourself who've, had a, in my opinion, and I think Taylor would agree, and I'm not sure how you feel, but a high degree of success. Hugo nomination, World's Best Fantasy, nominee, Goodreads Choice nominee, those sorts of things. And I know that as an author, and every author I talk to, I feel most of them have said that they cope with a certain degree of imposter syndrome. It varies, obviously, and it's weird how success affects that, and sometimes it's a detriment.
Yeah.
So how have you coped with, the success, of you as an author and your writing?
I am lucky in that I honestly don't have a great deal of imposter syndrome per se. Like whatever credit to my parents or something, I grew up reasonably bulletproof in that regard. Like I don't think I am like all that in a bag of chips. I don't think that I'm like the best author ever or anything like that. But I don't have that, oh my God, I actually suck and one of these days people will figure that out kind of feeling that I know a lot of people do have. So I'm really lucky in that regard. Uh, there is the aspect where I think a lot of us are also very prone to whatever brass ring you have achieved, there's always another one past it that you haven't gotten yet. And so there's the little voice going, well, yes, I've gotten a Hugo nomination, but I haven't won a Hugo. And like, I've gotten nominations for my novels, but not for my short fiction. Like, there's always something else. There's always going to be that I haven't gotten a movie deal. I haven't been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And I think that when kept in perspective, that's okay. A lot of those markers after a while start being things that aren't fully in your control. And so this is a thing I've done, like various mentorships for other writers, and they will talk about things like, my goal for this year is to get an agent. And my response is, that's not in your control. Querying agents is in your control. But actually getting one, like, you don't control how quickly do they even respond, right? Or like, are you going to make it through that particular gate? That's not within your power. And the more you hang your own sense of success on the stuff that's not in your power, the less happy you're going to be. So I try to tell people to think about the metrics that they can control. And that's what I try to take my own advice. I don't always succeed because, I'm human. But yeah, think about the things that are within your power.
But that is exceptional advice. And, and I totally concur that, the goalposts seem to keep moving as you achieve successes. And, I think it's tough to, while not minimizing the esteem and importance, something like a Hugo nomination, okay?
Yeah.
What's going on with the current controversy with the Hugos aside,
yeah.
It's still a prestigious thing,
right?
Even to get nominated, right?
Yeah.
And I think as authors, we tend to be also, a lot of us, goal setters, right?
Yeah.
In terms of just finishing a series,
right.
Getting a short published, whatever that is, you do have these markers that are constantly changing. But I think, I know for me, one thing that keeps me grounded is my friends like Taylor and my fellow, and in BookTube, my author friends, they keep you kind of, my wife, that circle that keeps you grounded. But I also think that, as you get more experience as a writer, the more books you write, you're only competing against yourself, right? And you're certainly not competing against other authors, because I think it's I actually love the author community in that it's so collaborative, it's so supportive, and everybody's cheering for each other. And there's a million different book tastes out there. You're going to find your audience. I'm going to find mine. We're not competing. It's all great, right? And we celebrate those successes of all of our author friends. But yeah, I found that the one thing I'm learning, and I'm certainly not as prolific as you, and haven't been at it as long as you, don't have as many books as you, is that the more books I write, the more that the yardsticks are all my own.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and I think it's inherent to this job that you've got to be a self-directed person to make this work. Because fundamentally, there's a lot of time that you spend working toward even those first milestones. And the only person making you do that work is you, probably. Because, if you, there are easier ways to be miserable, basically, than to be toiling away, having not published anything yet. And so you've got to find a way to not be miserable with that, right? You've got to figure out how to enjoy the process of writing, or enjoy sharing what you've done with somebody whose opinions you trust, or whatever. We've all got to have that degree of self-direction. And so, yeah, it does manifest in things like those moving goalposts. But I don't think that's entirely a bad thing, because I don't ever want to stagnate. And I think especially when you've been in this for a while, you've got to look for those ways of how do you challenge yourself. That's partly the joy of doing things like, apparently I'm writing poetry now. And I'm like, well, that's a new thing to try. And that's going to help me be more flexible and grow in ways that I wasn't doing before. I think we've all probably read the occasional author where, we should all be so lucky as to have a career that goes on for 50 years or something. But you get to their later books and you're like, yeah, they're kind of just, treading water and doing the same thing they used to do less excitingly. I'm like, I don't want to be that. I want to put that off for as long as I can and keep doing something new and interesting, even though there's a risk that I'm going to have readers who go, what the hell is she doing now? This is not what she used to do when I'm bored. So
yeah. No, I hear you. And it's not all about, and I don't know if you found this, but I think some of those authors you're referring to, and I'm not naming names or pointing, and I'm not even criticizing, some of it is financial. It's they have a formula. It's very formulaic. that formula is what their fans expect. That sells.
Yep.
And to deviate from that may or may not, that may not be good, right? Financially, in terms of book sales. So
yeah, especially if you're somebody where like your family depends on your writing income, then gambling on new experimental things is maybe not a good move for you.
Exactly.
And I'm not going to throw stones at anybody for that.
Yeah, exactly. But I know exactly what you're saying, and I think there's a hell of a lot easier ways to make money than being an author. There's only a small percentile that actually makes really, really good money doing it. But obviously that means that predominantly authors do it for the love and the joy of writing and want to share their stories, and that's a good thing. So
I mean, it would be great if we all got paid more, but
yeah, it would be. It's okay.
And that's the truth. But I'm not an author myself, but I always find it so fascinating whenever PL kind of engages with our guests in the author side of things, how closely that resonates with just content creation in general, being on BookTube and all of that. Those goalposts, okay, well, I made this many subscribers. What about the next one? Or, oh, this is the best video I've ever made. Okay, well, the next one's got to be better. But I agree that you have to kind of be like that to be in the creative space. But I do kind of want to pull it to the reading side a little bit here, because I know that you also read very voraciously, and you do little, that was patronizing. I didn't mean to say little reviews. I mean short reviews. Is the word I was trying to say.
They are
short
small.
Reviews on your your website that are there for people to read. So I'm curious, recently, have you read, you brought up Murderbot, but have there been any other recent reads kind of on your radar that maybe, if not a recommendation, made you think that you'd like to highlight?
I'm always amused when I get asked these questions, because I have this magical ability. The minute I get asked that question, I forget everything I have ever read. Like, it just...
You are not the only
Yeah. There's a reason since 2011, actually, I've been keeping a list of what I read, which is very, very helpful. Like, last night, literally, a friend was saying, what are some recent things you've read that you thought were really great and would recommend to me? And I basically went, hang on, let me grab my laptop, because I cannot answer that question without looking at my list. But in this particular instance, since it is sitting right here in the room with me, I have started reading. I'm only about a third of the way into Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, which I will admit I initially heard about in the context of people saying, oh, this reminds me of the Memoirs of Lady Trent, because it's slightly post-Victorian. It's 1909, and it is a female scholar kind of going out on field expeditions to study, in her case, fairies instead of dragons. It is written as her diary entries, so yeah, it's an apt comparison, I will say, of it has a similar kind of vibe. And I've gotten a lot pickier as I, read more, and as I'm more of a writer. There is sort of a danger, PL, you probably run into this too, that like you can kind of see how the sausage is being made in some ways, and it means the stuff that you enjoy, you appreciate more. But there's a lot of stuff that you're like, yeah, I would have enjoyed this 10 years ago, and now it's not working for me. So I was very delighted with this one, that right there on the first page, there was a sentence about how this particular steamer ship carried like a great variety of cargo and a much smaller variety of passengers. And just that little prose bit there of the nice like inversion of great variety of this, much smaller variety of that. And it gave me that subconscious feeling of, I'm in good hands here. And that was very pleasing to me. So I'm only about a third of the way in, but I'm enjoying it a lot. And yeah, if you like the Memoirs of Lady Trent, I think this is a very apt comparison to that series.
Immediately added to DVR while you're talking. Yeah, I've seen a lot of people talking about this book, actually. It's been taking off in the BookTube space, so it was already kind of on my radar. But with that comparison, consider it done. Like, that's happening. And I definitely sympathize with forgetting things that you've read. That is what I do, and I still can't seem to remember. I always have to look behind me. So I apologize for springing that question on you.
No, it comes up in many interviews, and I really ought to be ready for it, and somehow I never am.
Well, I guess kind of in the same vein of books that you've read, do you have an author, or not an author, let me just say a story in general that has inspired you to kind of become the writer you are today, be it a video game you played, a story, a TV show you watched? Is there something that seems to be embedded?
I actually have the like precise moment that happened. There was an author that I read a great deal of growing up. Actually, I still read her books now. Diana Wynne Jones. She was a British children's fantasy author. Yeah, okay, you know Diana Wynne Jones. Um, and I was like 9 or 10 years old. I don't remember exactly when this happened. I just remember the moment that I read her book Fire and Hemlock, in which you have two characters who are telling a story together. And for whatever reason, like, most kids, I think, make up stories. And then eventually most people stop doing it, and I just never stopped. I remember putting that book down and thinking, I want to tell a story. And thinking of it in the sense not just of like something that I would play around with in my own head, but that I wanted to share with other people. I wanted to tell a story, not just imagine a story. And that was basically the moment I decided I wanted to be a writer. So, boom, like there you go. Fire and Hemlock by Diana Wynne Jones. Even though that book, finally, a couple of years ago, I came across a blog post that makes me feel like at last, in my 40s, I have come to understand the ending of that book. I did not understand it at all, and yet it is still a hugely influential book in my life.
Yeah, I have the folio edition of Howl's Moving Castle here, so yeah,
Yeah.
I'd like to get the whole collection eventually. But that was a little birthday gift to
I was to say
myself.
folio
So
editions are gorgeous and pricey. We cannot
yes,
have all
that's
the
why I
things we
only
want.
have the number one, but
Yeah.
it's a pride of place on my shelf.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of her
But-
first books I read as well. Fire and Hemlock came a little later, I think.
I did want to, just before we move on, I did want to pull up in reference to the Emily Wilde series. Meg says, I'm so excited for book 3. It does remind me of the Memoirs of Lady Trent in the studying aspect. Would be nice if there were sketches included, like in Lady Trent. And that is something that I did want to ask you, and I kind of forgot, and I'm so glad that Meg brought this up, is one of the best aspects about those books, reading them physically, is that you do have sketches and art, and it really helps immerse you again in the world. Was that something that you had to push for to have in the book? Like, no, I need these in here, or?
It was a request that I made kind of in the full knowledge that they might say no, because that is an added expense for a book. And in fact, if you get the original, like, first edition hardcovers of the Memoirs of Lady Trent. I think later printings don't have this, but my editor at the time did a number of things with the creation of those books that they're the only books I've ever had where reviewers have talked about the book as a physical object in their review, because he got it printed where with hardcovers these days, mostly it's like one solid piece that goes all the way around for the binding, whereas older books would have what they called a three-piece case, where you've got the front piece, the back piece, and then a binding. The binding is a separate element. And so there's like a contrasting color in the three-piece case. They have the deckled edges, which is where the page edges are a little bit uneven, because it used to be that, like, back in the Victorian period, you had to cut the paper, like, fold it over, and you cut it with a knife before you read the book. So he got these elements done. He got it printed in kind of like a sepia type, and he also championed the idea of those internal sketches, all of which came together to make the book feel much more like a 19th century thing. It had like that added tactile and visual element to it that made it feel more period. So yes, I asked for it because I had written it into the story that Isabella was enough of an artist to be able to do drawings in the field, which is actually a very important skill for field biologists even now. Like, that's something that they train in how to do. And yeah, it absolutely were like, it would add so much to the story if you were willing to spring for this kind of expensive thing, especially since you're paying Todd Lockwood to do it. And, he's kind of a, top artist. And so, yeah, they got Todd to do like 10 internal sketches for each book. And it's why I've seen reviewers say, like, oh, if you read it in print, you miss out on Kate Redding's narration for the audiobook. But if you only listen in audiobook, you don't get the drawings and everything. Like, both formats are really good. I wish more books had that element. Yeah, I wish more books had that, where I think it would fit really well, but I understand why publishers can't always spring for it.
Yeah, I just have to say those first printings are unicorns. I'm a book collector in, like, the real name of the word. So I eBay, I got the notifications. Your books are unicorns. Those first printings.
It is hard to track them down at this point. Yeah, like the later printings don't have all the fancy bells and whistles. So.
Yeah.
That also means that, again, your body of work is growing. The fact that, your backlist now is different from what it was, 5 years ago. So
Yeah.
that's fantastic.
I have to say, one of the things that I've been really glad about with, like, there's pros and cons with a lot of the stuff going on around, like, self-publishing, indie publishing, etc. But the ability to take your own backlist when it goes out of print with the original publisher and get it back out there,
Yeah. Yeah.
that is a godsend. Like, being able to have all of my novels available for purchase, no matter how old they are, yay for that part.
Yeah, that is awesome. So we also may want to make sure that we asked you about anything new that you have coming out.
I have a book that is in fact coming out on Tuesday. So this is very nicely timed for that. It was originally supposed to be published on February 6th, and then it got pushed back. The Market of 100 Fortunes, that is the last of those Legend of the Five Rings novels we mentioned. These are game tie-in books, but I will say they are explicitly supposed to be written in a fashion where they are interesting and accessible to people who don't know the setting. Like, you don't have to know the game, you don't have to play the game. Effectively, if something in a setting that is inspired by historical Japan sounds good to you, then these could be right up your alley. The first book of that series is The Night Parade of 100 Demons, which people who know their Japanese folklore know that that's an idea from the folklore. And so, yeah, they're supernatural mysteries. They are a queer romance. They are me getting to just wave my folklore flag all over the place, going, "Isn't this cool?" So, yeah, if that's your kind of thing, then the trilogy is going to be complete 2 days from now.
Well, you just said so many buzzwords. You know me by now, I think, from this
Yeah.
chat that you just sold me those. So my TBR is getting longer. But if they did want to go and purchase those,
Mhm.
is there a best place to go for them? Or?
I will say, so on my website, I have links to a bunch of different retailers. I will freely admit to being pretty anti-Amazon, if you are able to go with other options, but I've got links to a bunch of ebook retailers and print places. Bookshop.org is my preferred place for doing my book shopping these days, because it's a whole thing of like working with independent bookstores and such. So it's a pretty good place to get things. But yeah, I have a number of links if people have preferred retailers or just want to see what some of the options are.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, time always it's so fast. We're almost at an hour and a half, so we don't want to keep you for too long. And thank you for joining us even after undergoing a medical procedure not too long ago. We really appreciate you joining us and taking the time to be
Oh, this has
here.
been delightful.
But oh, yay! I'm glad it's not just one-sided then. 'Cause
No,
me
look,
too.
you're asking me about like world building and stuff. Of course, I'm gonna be like, oh yes, can we talk about that?
Kindred spirits.
Yeah.
But if people are watching this back later and want to, look at your backlist or figure out more
Mhm.
about you or interact with you on social media, where can they go to find you out there?
So my website is swantower.com, and I am on Mastodon and I am on Blue Sky. I am no longer on the thing formerly known as Twitter. I left that some months ago. But yes, I can be found on social media. The links are there on my website under the contact section if you want to track things down. It's got a setup where you can kind of subscribe to the blog so that you'll get emailed when there's a new post there, and you'll get my book reviews and such. There's the Patreon, which is Swan_Tower, I think is my username there. Or if you just search for Maire Brennan Patreon or New Worlds Patreon, you'll find years worth of thoughts about world building, all of which, by the way, have been gathered into yearly collections. The 7th one of those is going to be coming out soon. So if you like the world building stuff, I got stuff for you.
Well, I think you have a market for that. So
It sounds like this.
yeah, right?
Yeah, given PL's inclinations, given your interests, I suspect that the people who watch your channel are a good audience for my thoughts on that. Because yeah, I just love
Certainly.
digging into those details.
Yeah, there's a lot of world building nuts in our sphere. So
Yeah.
what about you, PL? Where can they find you?
Well, first of all, I don't know what I was going to say, but thanks so much, Marie, for coming on. As Taylor said, it's awesome, especially considering you were ill. So thank you. Wonderful to have you. Great interaction with you. You can usually find me beside Taylor on her channel or mine for page chewing. When we have a lot of amazing guests, such as Marie, planned for the year. So stay tuned to that. The books, www.plstuart.com is my website. That's where you can find out more about the Drowned Kingdom saga. 3 books currently out, and one, 4 now. You have to remind yourself when you release the book. How many do I have again? I got 4. So Alliance Pride, book 4 in the Drowned Kingdom saga has just been released, and most people say it's kind of a game changer. So that's I'm very pleased with that. Out of the 7-book series, this is like the middle book, so kind of a turning point book. And you can reach me on social media, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call them. Still there, hanging on, at PL Stuart Writes. Same for Facebook and Twitter. Before we go blog, shout out to the wonderful Beth Tavler and the crew, the blog site where a lot of my reviews are posted. I'm an assistant editor there, as is Taylor. And you can also see my reviews on Goodreads. But predominantly, look for me in terms of this YouTube space on Taylor's channel or mine doing page chewing.
Yes, and before we go, I just wanted to pull up some of these thanks that you're getting, Marie, for being on here. So this was great. Thank you all so much. I'm glad I could listen in on this interview, and I will go back and listen to the beginning, is what Meg says. And then we also have thank you for the great conversation. So just everyone in the comments, thank you so much for coming by. It's your interactions and your viewing that really brings it up to the next level. So if you have just stumbled upon this, maybe you're a fan of Marie and happen to find this interview, my name is Taylor. My BookTube channel is Made Between the Pages. You can find me here doing page chewing quite often with PL, as he mentioned. I am also an assistant editor over at Before We Go blog, and also a judge in the current SPIFBO, self-published fantasy blog off, there we go, competition. So we're very involved in the indie world as well. Any links to any social media will be down below in the description, as well as links to Marie's website. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. This was a delightful discussion, and I truly feel like I found a kindred anthropology spirit out there.
Like you guys are great to talk to because you're interested in all the same things that I'm like, oh yes.
We all just kind of do this together. So.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Thank you for joining us, everyone, and we will see you on the next episode of Page Chewing. See you.
Bye.